Today we're going to talk about good science versus bad science versus science that was done with goodwill but turned out bad. So what is good science? What is good research? What's a good article or a good journal? How can we know that the scientific articles that we read on the internet are actually good science that we can rely on? Can we just read any article that's ever been published? And what's the difference between a blog article and a journal article? What should we actually believe? Now, this has always been a question that we scientists have been focused on and worried about in our scientific careers. And so I'm going to give you some tips specifically in sports science research, but this also applies to psychology, to medicine, etc., how you can figure out if the article that you're reading is actually good research. Here it's important to note that as scientists, it's our responsibility to do good science, good research, to publish actual factual information that we actually found without cherry picking results to make us look good. That is our prerogative, that is our responsibility. Now, as the human race does, it doesn't always work that way, right? Some people want to have a very specific conclusion. Some people cherry pick their own data in order to get this conclusion. Some people are paid to get this conclusion. Now, some journals don't even accept papers that are null hypotheses. Basically, they found no difference between groups. Null, nothing has changed. We detected no differences between groups. And journals tend to not like those very much because they're not thought of to be groundbreaking science or groundbreaking findings. But not everything has to be groundbreaking to be really meaningful and to help us move our field and move our world forward. Now, even good science done in goodwill can be incorrect, and science done with good methodology can also be incorrect. And we can find out later, for example, that it was complete bullshit what was found in the study, that there was some sort of error, or that the population that was studied at the time, the results weren't there. And later we find results in that group, but in this study we didn't, or whatever the case may be. Even science done in good faith with good methodology can be wrong, and we often find that out later when we try to repeat that study. And that's why we have the scientific concept called replicating, where studies that have already been done and have a significant finding behind them should be able to be replicated exactly the same, and that finding should also be there in that replicated study. And that's how we know that our data is good, so to speak. That's also why we as scientists should always be very careful to not make across-the-board claims like, here's what the research says, but rather to say, current research says this, or as we currently know, or as far as we know at the moment. And that's also why in articles you'll often read study limitations and opportunities for future research that the author has put together based on their study, what they found to be limiting factors. We need to be really specific in listing off the limiting factors of our study so that, again, anybody who's looking to replicate this study can then know what limitations were there and how that might have influenced the data. And we should also always give recommendations for future research so that people can study this concept, this phenomenon, this topic further. Science is always moving forward. That's the point. That's a good thing. How can you know that the science you're reading is actually correct? Can you just Google PubMed and then type into PubMed any 2 words and trust the top 5 articles about that topic that you're getting great information? Unfortunately, that's not the case. The first thing that we're going to look at is the journal. So let's talk about judging journals. When we're talking about good science, we're really talking about peer-reviewed journals. What does that mean? It means that when I write a paper as a scientist, as an academic, as a researcher, and I send it into this journal, they are going to have 2 to 3 reviewers read over my paper, make sure that the edits are correct, make sure that the data is correct, look for any methodological errors, look for any calculation errors, look for grammatical errors, look for anything that's just not understandable or anything that's blatantly wrong. So you're having 3 objective people who are not paid by the journal look at my research to make suggestions. Then I have to do those revisions, whether major or minor revisions, or it could be completely rejected from the journal. And if I do these revisions, I need to revise, and then I send it back into the journal, and I might be able to be published by that journal. This is called the publication process or the reviewer process. It's a huge pain in the ass for academics, but it's really important that we have this peer review so that I'm not just putting any old research that, again, could have thousands of errors in it into the public eye for people who are not researchers, who don't know to look for these methodological errors. It's already been reviewed. So good journals will always be peer reviewed in some way by other scientists. This is how we hold each other accountable. The next thing you could do is Google the journal. Usually the top search results, if it's a bad journal, are going to be complaints about that journal. If it's a good journal, it probably has a website, it's probably hosted by a publisher, and the next thing you can do is test the impact factor or the eigenfactor. If you go to eigenfactor.org, you can type in any journal and see how many citations they have, how many articles they've published over 5 years, and other important data about the impact of this journal to the scientific community. Essentially, how important it's considered to be, how reliable it's considered to be. Another thing to look at is if there's any high value or big articles on that website or in that journal. If it's not a high-powered journal, it's probably not going to have any scientific breakthroughs. And as easy as it is to think that the scientific community is against certain types of medical breakthroughs or scientific breakthroughs, that's actually not the case. Scientific breakthroughs are usually going to be published in big journals that are also peer-reviewed because they are on the precipice of new science, of good science, of scientific breakthroughs. So they're going to want to publish it. The next thing we're going to do is judge the articles. And this is where it gets interesting. So we've already judged the journals that the articles are in. We know which journals we're looking at, which ones are reputable based on eigenfactor and peer review and reputation, number of citations, number of articles across 5 years, and a variety of other things. Now let's move on to the article itself. Here's what you need to look for. Typos. There's a huge review process that takes a very long time and is very intricate in order to even get published in these respected, important journals. Considering how many reviewers there are and how many reviews have to be done and how strict it is, if it's a blue ribbon journal, there aren't going to be typos. That article will never be published with numerous typos in it. So if there's typos in your article, the next thing we want to look at is sample size. So you're going to find this under the methods section under participants. One is generalizability. If I have a small sample size of 8, 15, 20 people, and again, this is supposed to be a groundbreaking finding, it's not highly generalizable, meaning it's not going to actually be the case for the entire population just based on 15 people. We need to study a lot more people than 15 people to say this is true for everybody. This is undoubtedly how it is. And that's whether we're talking about speed, whether we're talking about psych, whether we're talking about COVID, whether we're talking about weightlifting. If we have a small sample size, especially if it's only from one gender, and the majority of sports science has been done in men because women are too difficult because of their hormones. If we've got 15 men in one study, we cannot say and claim that the findings of this study are generalizable to all populations because it's not. So it is important to look at the population that was studied, how many people, how many male versus female. It should be fairly evenly split. It doesn't have to be exactly 50-50, but you get what I mean. There need to be all parties present, essentially, to really be able to generalize things. The other thing is, if I'm only testing pro athletes, I cannot generalize findings that I found in pro athletes to other athletes. Unless I have both elite athletes and amateur athletes in my study and a couple of people in between, I cannot say that all athletes have this. It's just simply not the case because I haven't tested it on all populations. It's not generalizable. The next thing is power, and this also has to do with sample size. And power is important because it helps us to understand if our results are actually significant and not just a small change, not just a fluke. Now, effects, whether they're significant or not, are harder to detect in smaller sample sizes. So if you have a small sample size, you're going to have low power just by the fact of you're not testing on very many people. And it's going to be a lot easier to get what's called type 2 error, meaning a null hypothesis or a false negative. Whereas if you had a greater population and more power, you're more likely to find the intricate details and find out faster whether or not they're significant. The next thing to look for is something very specifically marked, an ethics application, whether that's an IRB or a Helsinki Declaration. If there is no ethics application listed somewhere under methods, we have a problem because all research on animals and on humans, so basically all sports science research, has to have an ethics application, and it needs to be approved by the ethics board, whether at the university or somewhere else at their institution, in order to even start the study. So if there's no ethics application, we already have a big problem. Staying in the methods, and we need to look at if how they completed the study actually matches up with the claims. So for example, if in this long-term study, we found that the long-term effects of this and that are this, but the study was only 2 weeks long, and that was it. That's not long-term. So that doesn't match up. So look for inconsistencies in the claims that are made, and then also double check it in the methods that actually how they executed the study matches up to what they claim. All right, let's move on from the methods to the results and discussion. Now, what happens very often, especially with university students, is nobody can really understand or care about the methods or the results. So we skip from introduction, where we get the basic information about the concept and what the study is going to be about, to the discussion and conclusions, where we get essentially the explanation of what they found in the research and what they can conclude from their data. Unfortunately, the results, where the actual data, like the statistics, are actually listed out, and the discussion are not always correct. First of all, in non-peer-reviewed journals, you're very likely to have things that are inconsistent between your results and your discussion. In peer-reviewed journals, though, you might even find some things are cherry-picked. For example, if you found that your results were actually completely different than what you expected, you can still somehow kind of turn it in the discussion to make it sound like it fit your hypothesis, or at least close. Or there were no changes, however, and then they kind of explain away the results. So always read the results section as well, because that will tell you, and has to tell you, the actual data, actual results, and whether or not they're significant. Whereas in the discussion, it gets a little fuzzy. So I would always recommend still trying to read the results if you can, to just double check that there's no cherry picking, no inconsistencies, and not something just completely left out from the discussion itself. We're moving on to the end of the discussion and the conclusion. All authors should list off the limitations of their study, and most studies have limitations. That could be, it was only 2 weeks long, although we wanted to do a long-term intervention. We only tested this in soccer players and not basketball players, so we don't know if it's for field and court sports. It might just only be applicable for soccer. Or we only tested this on men. We also need to test in women. And then with these limitations, which are very important because we need to be self-critical, and it's vital that we publish and let other people know about where our study might fall short, that we then also turn that into suggestions for future research. So if you were to replicate this study, we would recommend having males, females, and diverse people in this study to double check and see if it's actually generalizable data, or if it was just a fluke that happened to us because we were testing men over 2 weeks. Or we would recommend testing this over a period of 2 years as opposed to 1 year. Or we would recommend using a more reliable testing method, for example, because we found that our data was limited by our testing method. That's important then to list in future research. And last but not least, one of the things that always makes me laugh is third-party financing, and you should always be able to find this after the conclusion. In published research, researchers always need to give essentially a statement of not having been influenced by third-party funding, basically having your interests, I don't know. We will have a stunningly significant finding in the research. Very often that's to prove that a specific method of testing or a specific method of training or specific equipment was significantly, very particularly effective, etc. And then we find out in the third party, if you read far enough, that the study was funded 100% completely by this organization or institution. And that's when I start to ask questions like, okay, so you gave all of the equipment for this, all of the testing equipment, and then you funded the study, and the research is published on your website and nowhere else. I'm starting to think you paid the authors. And I wish that it was false and rude for me to say that, but it has happened in science, and people have had to take back articles that were published in journals because people found out about their third-party funding and basically that they were paid off. Even science done in good faith and done correctly at the time, or what we thought was correctly, and in peer-reviewed journals, science is just not perfect because scientists are still people, and we need to be aware of that. However, in science, it's very hard to make a lot of money by doing good science. For academics and researchers, it's so important to continue to publish because a lot of people's tenure tracks, their resumes, their promotions all depend on how many times they've published, how often they've published, and the significance of their findings. And so that has actually motivated people to publish in journals that are not good and to publish data that's not necessarily good in order to keep up. It's very hard. It's very competitive. So just be really careful. Again, judge the journals hard, judge the articles hard. Not all journals are the same. Not all articles are the same. Everything needs a very critical eye. Check through those things that I pointed out when you're reading through articles. Double check that everything's consistent. Make sure your sample size is up, that you have enough power. Read through the limitations. Read through the considerations for future research. And double check that third-party financing section. I hope that was somehow helpful. I know that it's a really difficult topic, and not everybody is happily just reading research all the time because it is very exhausting, especially when you need to be critical with what research you're reading. But please try it out. Research is really important. And make sure that the research that you're taking in, that the data you're taking in is good. And remember, the findings that are published right now are just current research. That is not to say that findings will not change. The research won't find out something else. We're always trying to move further. That's the whole point of science.